because national interests had led to protectionism in the 1930s, and that then led to war. So national interest was kind of not something people were keen about. But in the 1990s, people started to look at these member states of the EU and say, well, they're all democracies. They're all got consensual political systems. They're all legally constrained. These are liberal democracies. We should be nicer about them, right? So this theory of liberal intergovernmentalism appeared. And that one basically says that member states, they create their own preferences and they express those preferences in the member state institutions, right? So that's a completely legitimate thing for a state to do. And that's one way of looking at the EU. The other way is to look at the EU as the product of lots of different interests. So lots of different people like the idea of European integration. Lots of people would like to see more transactions, more business being made at the European level. They'd like to see regulatory barriers between member states removed. They'd like to see there be more business. And they'd like to get rid of these market failures. You might have heard these kind of arguments from the World Bank, for example. But this idea that free markets generates a happier, more liberal world is very much part of the Washington consensus of this neoliberal trend that we've lived through, well, I've lived through most of my life. So the idea there is that, market failures are revealed through market activity, and then the EU legislates to develop solutions through lobbyists and that kind of activity. So if we look at European integration from that perspective, and we look at the parliamentary elections from that perspective, we can say, well, this is quite serious. The security issues are really important. The war in Ukraine has showed that European integration can't keep expanding. It's grown massively since 2000, since the end of the Cold War. It can't keep growing to Ukraine. There's definitely a hard limit there, and maybe it'll get pushed backwards. It also showed that the Europeans' kind of assumption that America will come charging to the rescue, also not so clear. Obama wasn't very keen on sorting out Europe's problems. Trump obviously wasn't. So in many ways, Europe's security position has been problematized, and Europe has kind of had to address this quite existential threat that's come from Russia. In previous elections, Brexit was heavily influenced by Russian bots and by influence and money, as have French and German elections been. Brexit, as I said, also showed that some really important national players in the European project could also just, up and go, right? That's a really big existential crisis for the European Union. But it's also shown that there were quite big divisions within the member states. So lots of people in France and Greece and Germany and Italy have said, maybe we'd like to follow England, follow Britain and leave the EU. And also, as I said, COVID created some really interesting responses from different member states of hoarding vaccines, this phenomenon of vaccine nationalism. So rather than everybody in the EU saying, let's all share our vaccines, member states kept them to themselves and didn't necessarily share them. And that led to some real issues. So you could say that this vote against the EU has been the product of some fairly significant challenges to the European Union as a system of integration. You can also push back on that, though, because you've also had some quite impressive developments of European integration in the last period, right? So you've had far greater foreign policy cooperation since the Ukraine war. You've got a security market developed across the EU where they pool military resources. Brexit actually led to greater integration in the EU. Yes, some people didn't like it, but you also saw far more member states coming behind the Commission to negotiate terms with the EU than going against them. There's been new forms of collaboration around health policy and a new Green Deal, which has also launched the EU into new policy agendas. Arguably also, in terms of integration, the European Parliament is not that important. All it can do is approve treaties. It doesn't really negotiate them, which the member states do. Okay, so together, we can see a bit of a balanced picture here. We can see that the European parliamentary elections are possibly indicative of a broader challenge to the EU, but also we can see that quite a lot of sausage is still being made despite these difficult times, and that in many ways the European Union looks fairly stable in how it's operating. So the international relations perspective can be helpful, but there are limits to it. The key question, perhaps, if we're interested in democracy and we're interested in understanding how we can organise the world in a more effective, democratic way, is to think about what the electorate think and how far they have an input into the EU. And when we look at the charts, when we look at the broad kind of information, the broad feedback that we get from the EU, from the citizens in the EU through surveys, we find there's an awful lot of data. Has anybody heard of the World Value Survey? Anybody heard of that? Just put your hands up if you heard of that at all. If you're interested in trends of authoritarianism against cosmopolitanism or progressiveness, of individual rights against traditional beliefs, then look at the World Value Survey. It's a really old survey. It starts off in the 1970s in the EU, but it's now a global thing. Ronald Inglehart, who's a very prominent political scientist, set it up. You can do loads of interesting comparative work by looking at this survey. Eurobarometer is the European Union's version of it, and they ask questions over long time frames, and they capture really interesting patterns. And what that survey has shown, when asked about how EU citizens feel about the EU and about democracy, generally you can see that they're pretty happy. 3/4 of the respondents say they feel they are citizens of the EU, although many people identify with being a citizen of a nation state. Still, they're also quite happy to be a citizen of the European Union as well. So that shows a lot of support. In fact, against feeling they're part of the EU has gone down since 2010, despite Brexit, despite the other stuff. They're also broadly satisfied with how the EU operates as a democracy. And that's an interesting thing to observe, because 27 was a global financial crash, and the poorer countries in Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, they were really hammered by the financial crash. They lost lots of money. They were punished by the richer states for getting into economic problems. And you can see that there's a long period there until about 2016 where people aren't so happy. They're not liking it so much. After Brexit, people start to think it's a little bit better. And that's what people have called, Catherine de Vries called that the benchmarking effect, where other member states like Greece and France, where there had been a discussion about leaving the EU, we're looking over the English Channel, looking at what was going on in the UK and thinking, oh, well, not so good. Not what we want. I don't know if you followed this a little, but it's not gone terribly well. Okay, should we leave it at that? Okay, let's leave it at that. So the Brexit phenomenon had an impact on how other member states in the EU perceived their membership of the EU, and arguably made them more satisfied, right? So people have reacted differently to that. We've also got more support for a stronger and more independent EU, and in particular in common defence and security. Why is that important? Well, defence and security are high politics issues, right? This is what member states cling on to, right? This is what international relations is all about, defence and security. And here you've got a really consistent 3/4 of the electorate in the EU saying that they think there should be more collective work by the member states at the European level in defence and security. Now, what's interesting about that question is that's quite a nice question to say, to ask people a question about. But if you ask the question, would you die for Europe? The numbers are a little bit different. But that's a bigger ask, right? But my basic point is there's lots of kind of popular support for the EU. Also, despite COVID, despite cost of living crisis from the war in Ukraine and inflation of fuel prices and all that kind of stuff, people are also, just about thinking the economy is looking okay. I wouldn't say they're massively enthusiastic about it, but the perception has been that the economic situation has improved slightly, especially since 23. So you can see here, that first line in, can I do this thing here? Is that working there? You can just see here, 2008, you've got the financial crash. It's a disaster. And that carries on until 2017. When people are thinking, oh, well, UK's not looking so good, so you get a bit of a spike there. Then you get the COVID pandemic, it all goes to pot again. Then the EU starts to pump money into the European economy through this new Green Deal, and eventually it starts to look a bit better, right? You have the war, obviously, the Ukraine war, which is the last bump there for the bad economy. But broadly, there's a slight shift. Basically, it's not all falling apart, right? And that's been in pretty difficult times. So the question is then, why is it that if it's been going so well for so long, why is everybody complaining about it? I mean, what's the problem? Okay, it's delivering on lots of different areas. And you can see here that if you look at the performance of anti-establishment populist parties in the 2019 and 2024 elections, the blue line shows them all going up. And this is all in the different member states, right? You can see all the flags. They're all going in one direction. You're getting increased support for anti-establishment populist political parties across the EU. So that's an interesting question, right? That's an interesting question for a political scientist, and for politicians, really. They're getting it right. Nobody likes them. I mean, how miserable is that? So one of the things that you do as a political scientist is you look at the institutions, right? You look at the way that actors are organized by rules and how that gets them to do things in a certain way, right? And as I said before, that's the kind of the thing that political scientists really get excited by. And in a political system, as I said, we're looking at legislative, executive, judicial, representative politics, and we can look at these patterns and ask ourselves, well, is that particularly new, what we've seen there, or is this something which is is the European parliamentary elections in 2024, is it a one-off? Does it indicate a massive change in behaviour? And we can look at these kind of patterns and the rules that generate them to understand what's going on. And that's what I want to do just now for a moment. Okay, so one of the more reliable political science rules or theories, if you like, is Reifenschmidt's second-order election thesis. Who's heard of Reifenschmidt's second-order election thesis? Okay, not so many. It always seems to work. I've been teaching you politics for 30 years. It kind of always works. And what it says is quite simple. It's quite intuitive. It says when you have a first-order election, you have a different result to a second-order election, right? So a first-order election will be the national election where it's all covered in the press, everybody's interested, it all matters. And the second-order election is your local council who decides, whether the bins go out, or how many potholes are in the road, all that kind of stuff. And the second-order elections tend to not do so well. And the argument that Reifenschmidt have is that the European parliamentary elections are second-order in nature. And that has some very clear results. The first is that you get lower levels of participation. If you look on the right here, I'm sorry, it's a really tiny graphic. But this one here, top right, you can see that there's a distribution beneath the line, right? Beneath the correlation line. And that shows, the bottom line is showing participation in the preceding first order election. And then the vertical axis is showing participating in European parliamentary elections. And what you're seeing there is far more people showing up in the first order election, right? So big tick for Reifenschmidt. If we go down to this one here, we see the second finding, or the second assertion of Reifenschmidt, which is that when you have a second order election, people use it as a protest vote. Yes, is that a question? Go for it, mate. No, ask now if you want. But you have to shout. I don't know, can we get a microphone? Shout, go for it, yeah. Okay, I'll try and hear, yeah. No, it's not, it's good.
That people in the European Union are not happy with democracy in the European Union. So what's the alternative if it's not democracy?
Precisely. We'll get to that. That's an excellent point. I mean, so...
Thank you.
Where is it? It's this one, right? Yeah? Yeah, so, I mean... It's a lovely question because it allows me to talk about something else, which is quite interesting. So, up until the mid-1980s, nobody really cared about the European Union. It was just an elite thing which fancy, posh people went and did. And then around the mid-1980s, people started to think about the single market because they could see their jobs going, and they were like, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And people would say, well, your jobs are going, but you can stop working in a mine and you can work in a coffee shop or as a lawyer. You can do a service economy job. It's nicer. And then people started to go, well, whose decision? What gives you the right to make that decision? Power from member states had become less, and power for the European global level had gone up, right? And that created what was called a democratic deficit. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about the World Trade Organization, when they talk about international political economy and the decisions that affect your lives, are talking about how big corporate actors are dominating big international organizations and, exploiting this democratic deficit. Right. So the idea that the EU could become more democratic was meant to be a response against that. And increasing the European Parliament's powers was the most obvious mechanism for doing that. So this question is really about that. It's saying, are you happy that the European Union is operating in a way that is adequately democratic to exercise powers for you. And what this is showing is a lot of people think it is, which is a bit odd. But that is the case. The alternative is to reduce the powers of the European Union, to reduce the European Parliament's role, and to increase the role of member states. It's a very strong argument that that is actually what's happened. But broadly, people tend to still see the European Parliament as being a source of democracy at that level, at a supranational level. And in many ways, it's quite unique because you can vote out MEPs, and you can't vote out people in the WTO or the UN and other international organisations. Does that answer your question? Okay. Can we do those at the end? Yeah, and you can have the mic and do that. That'd be great. All right, thanks for that. So it's an important point, right? Because why talk about the democracy in the European Union? It's not a member state. It's not a nation state. But at the end, we can come back to that a bit more because I think there's actually more interesting questions to ask than the ones I'm just asking now, which we could come back to. So where were we? Okay, so I was saying, yes, I was going through Reif and Schmidt, my favourite political theory. How could you interrupt my favourite political theory? I'm joking. So the first one is that you've got a drop in numbers turning up in comparison to the first order. Second thing is you get a protest vote. So people use second order elections to protest against the first order lot. So what this second one here, the U-shaped curve, it shows the proportion of the electoral cycle completed. That's along the x-axis. The y-axis is showing the difference of government parties' vote share. So it's showing that at the beginning of an electoral cycle, people tend to go, I voted for this party, I'm going to vote for them again. And then, halfway through the electoral cycle, they're going, oh my word, that was a wrong idea. I don't like them very much. I've got another opportunity to vote for that political party again in an election that doesn't really matter. I'm going to vote against them. And that's what's happening here. And you see the downward curve. And then, of course, what happens towards the end of an electoral cycle, governments start to throw money around and everybody loves them again and they vote for them. And so the curve goes up again. So government parties or incumbent governments tend to lose. The last one, which is the bottom right curve here, shows on the x-axis is the affected number of parties for the first order election. And the vertical one is the affected number of parties in the European election. Now, what this shows is another really interesting characteristic of second order elections, which is that it tends to get smaller political groupings emerging. So why is that? Well, big important electoral decisions, you think with your head, you work it out, you care about it, you've got a lot invested in it, you make the right decision because you're thinking about the next 5-10 years of your life and what that lot will going to do to you. But if it's not that important, but you're quite annoyed about something, you might use your vote for that. So in the European Parliament in the 1990s, there was a huge increase in the Green Party vote as people expressed their desire for more progressive green policies, for less pollution. But they didn't want to really change things too much because they still voted for the Conservatives or the right-wing parties or the polluting socialist parties in their national election, right? So they didn't do anything about it when it really mattered. But the European Parliament allowed them to make a protest vote. Now, what's interesting is that you can see these smaller emotional issues being represented by more diversity. They're less centralised, they're less organised, these smaller groups, so you get a higher number of them. And you can see there, if you look on the line, you've got quite a few which are bang on. But if you look beneath the line, that's the first order elections, you've got fewer than above the line, right? There's about 5 beneath, there's about 10 or 8 to 10 above the line. And that shows you get more smaller groups. So what you have in European parliamentary elections is people voting against their national government. Not so many are turning up, and they're also voting for things that really tick them off, that really annoy them. Things around sovereignty or immigration, right? That's another one which wins lots of votes in European parliamentary elections. So this is something which I think is quite interesting. It shows how the institutional rule of the European elections produces this kind of odd result. People can really quite like the EU, they can support it, they can be happy generally with how it's going, but they can also vote against it because of the way the second order elections operate means that they use it as a protest vote, they vote against austerity, they vote against people they think are taking their jobs or taking their whatever. That classic racist rant, which has been very popular, very effective in mobilising the far right against Europe. Brexit was all about a very clever strategy by Nigel Farage. Has anybody heard of the term heristhetics? Any political scientists here? So heristhetics describes how you don't win elections. Winning elections is great for 5 years. What you want to do is change the rules of the game, right? If you can change the rules of the game, then you're going to win loads of elections. And what Farage did is he stopped talking about the European Union as being undemocratic and unaccountable, because nobody really cared about that. In the 2009 elections, he started to talk about immigration and migrants, and he started to say they're taking your jobs. He started to say things like, I was on the train and I couldn't hear anybody speaking English. Or he turned up for a hustings, for an electoral competition, and he said, and he was about an hour late. He said, I'm sorry I'm late. The M4, the big motorway was full. It must have been all the migrants. So he's just talking nonsense, right? But he's planting it in people's minds in lots of different ways, in kind of a humorous way sometimes, not a nice way, but certainly for social media, absolutely worked a treat, right? So that Herestetics idea, that changing the rules of the game, is a really important aspect. And it works very well for second order elections. It's helped political parties which were insignificant get a foothold on the national stage and then become more significant. Farage turned the European debate into a migration debate, and that's why Britain left the EU. In Wales, European elections were used to build a national identity around Plaid Cymru, which is the Welsh party. They became a really important political force. Okay, so anyway, so now we understand what's happened, right? Okay, so we understand why it happened. Now the big question is, does it matter, right? Simon Hicks, who's the second author here, is a star in this field of comparative politics. He's the first person who really made the case for looking at the EU as a political system. He's generated some terrific work. And he did this report about this sharp turn to the right, which he predicted, that anti-Europeanists would top the poll, about how the Grand Coalition would become weakened, and how this might have an impact on policy issues. So I've shown you this slide before. It shows the weakening of that big consensus coalition, which kept everything together, and how slightly more radical voices have become more important. And you can see that if you map at those groups who get affected by if you map those political actors and what they supported, and then look at how that change in the European Parliament might affect European policy, you get this kind of pattern. So the centrist Grand Coalition would push through budgets. It would have quite big control on economic and monetary and foreign affairs issues. Now that's become less important. So you might find that the European Parliament is less coherent on its normative European foreign policy agendas. It might be less inclined to protect minority rights. If you look at the centre and left coalition, that's the more radical one, the Greens, the Social Democrats, the leftist parties. That's become much smaller. So some of their issues around gender equality, around protections on environment, that's likely to be less well supported by the European Parliament. And then when we look at issues which are centre and right coalitions, which are normally around agriculture, rural development, then you might see an increase in that. You might see more protectionist measures from the EU. It might affect trade policy for the EU. It might become more defensive. It might oppose more monetary integration. So if we look at a very specific piece of legislation, I'm nearly done now. Thank you for listening so well. The last thing is just, so what happens if there's a really big policy which really matters, right? What would this do to a really big policy? And the EU has long been this slightly moralizing force for climate change, right? It's argued very strongly for it. As I said, the Green Party in the 1980s and 1990s became very important. The EU was important in pushing forward on carbon trading, creating carbon markets. That's very much how it's operated, push for Paris, all these other kind of accords. Now, the most recent legislation that it's introduced has been even more significant. It's about reparations, about repairing the climate, repairing the environment. And what Hicks and his lot did was look at how whether that would have gone through with this Parliament. And what it shows, what his calculations basically show, is that it wouldn't have gone through. So that little thing about second order elections leading to a more antagonistic European Parliament has been sufficient enough to change the dynamic of the agenda of one of the major players in climate change, in advocating for environmental change at the global level. The European Union is big, right? It's a big, powerful economic player. It also has a lot of political clout. And if it's less able to pursue pro-environment, pro-sustainable agendas, then arguably that's not good for everybody. Okay. I'll skip that one. So there's two approaches: international relations approach and a political science, a comparative politics approach. Both tell us stuff, right, which is quite helpful. There are lots of other approaches. Feminist approaches, really interesting in thinking about care. The EU is old. It's old. If you go to Bilbao, northern Spain, everybody's over 70. You know, there's literally just old people. So it leaves young people. Where do they come from? Well, that creates really interesting issues around care and who does the caring, right? So gender is important. There's sexuality is important. Religion is important. There's lots of different lenses. Another really important one, which is part of that tradition, is to look at political economy, look at class, look at broader patterns of power distribution in the European economy. As I mentioned before, it's all about the money, people. So the people need to be happy with the money. And one of the big shifts has been this movement away from valuing work to valuing assets in the EU. So property prices have shot up. Amsterdam, property prices have gone crazy. And people are less inclined to pay for higher wages because lots of that work has been, redeployed around the world, right? That's put huge stresses on welfare compromises, which paid for people who now vote for populist parties, right? That's another way of looking at this. You can also look at austerity, that way of dealing with a financial crash. What they could have done is pump loads of money into the European economy and reflate the Portugals, Greece, Italy, Spain, give them a lot of money to rebuild their economies. But they didn't do that. Germany, Holland, all put pressure on them to save money, to cut back on their welfare budgets. That led to huge amounts of Euroscepticism. There's a whole generation of younger people in Greece and France and Italy who aren't in favour of the EU. European integration also can't compensate for the real costs of welfare. So a lot of people have been looking, like Samir Amin, on the origins of welfare in Europe and argued it's not a simple tax and spend thing. It's not rich people giving money to poor people in Europe. It's Europe taking money from around the world, from its colonies and through unfair trade practices, and using that surplus to distribute and buy off poorer people. And when that doesn't work so well, then the EU's in big trouble and poorer people don't vote for it. That's another argument. And then the last point is about climate change and whether the EU really works and whether the model that the EU has of using markets to deliver integration, deliver political cooperation, which is arguably the dominant form, as I mentioned before, whether that is any good for addressing climate change. Right? The big players in affecting climate change in the world now aren't markets. They're not hedge funds. They're not private equity or sovereign wealth funds. It's the big players. It's like China, which is the massive institutional investor in Africa, mainly in building infrastructure, in Latin America, buying up companies. These are the big players. It's big states with powerful agendas which can affect the changes. And the market can do things, but a lot of the money that's gone into climate action has been around managing the insurance risk effectively, rather than creating new infrastructure and long-term investments. Because financial markets want to be able to relocate. And a really good example of that is, if you bought any bonds in ecological transition, which were rated as being about ecological transition, they were growing fairly well up until the Ukraine war kicked off, and then all the money went into guns and into oil because the prices went up, and your assets just dropped like a stone. So markets not so good, people, not so good. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, so. First of all, thank you very much for your attention. Just some quick conclusions. The shift to the right-wing European Parliament is a challenge for those who just believe in the EU in one form, but it could lead to a different way in which the European Union is organised. It could lead to a less free market agenda. It could be linked to new forms of political representation, which could be more progressive than what we have already. You can argue that the support really matters because it generates national credibility. So if you look at national elections in Europe at the moment, you've had some very important moves to the right in Italy and France, and in Germany you've just had a right-wing national socialist being elected into power at the sub-state level. Still important though. We could also ask about the support for the EU on a demographic level, where the main support for the EU is coming and how resilient that is. And we can also ask about the strength of the EU and its democratic institutions, I just wanted to say a little bit about that. Arguably, nothing's really changed, right? you've had a bit of a pushback, but nothing's really changed. The European Parliament is a co-legislature. It shares legislation. It's not like a national parliament. It's not going to actually change the main foundational basis of the EU. It can't change the treaties. That's for the member states. The member states will continue to frame the debate, and while they feel that supporting domestic political rhetoric, which is anti-immigrant and anti-EU, works for them, they'll carry on doing that. And that's the conclusion I'd say from this, is that the real issue is about how Europe's future looks now, and how it can be reframed in different ways. And hopefully that will be something which you can input in as well, and there can be a broader debate around it, rather than it just being narrowly defined in the context of the European political electorate. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. What a lovely audience. I hope you haven't all just fallen asleep. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so do you have any questions? I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Is that okay? Ah, yeah, I've got an abundance of microphones here. If anybody would like to. Oh, okay, great.
Sir, there has often been criticism levied at the European Union, both here in India and in Europe itself, that it has not done enough about the topic of migration. And you have argued that there are other reasons that the European Union is going through the current situation. So what would you argue the European Union can do at the moment?
Okay, I can talk. Shall I just take that one? Yeah, so that's a really good question, right? The European Union as an entity, okay, so if we go back to the idea of European Union, it's built on the idea of ever closer union. It's a universalist humanitarian aspiration, right? From Kant. Immanuel Kant came up. Immanuel Kant was talking about Europeans. He didn't care about anybody else. There's not a vocabulary for European Union which incorporates the rest of the world, right? So your point about whether the EU can have a sensible conversation about migration is an absolutely valid one. So there's been lots of criticisms of the EU and its showboating about its normative powers, for example. But there are practical things that the argument could be advanced for. So first of all, if you look at the contribution of migrants to Europe or to the different parts of the EU, it's enormous, right? If you look at the cuisine, the labour force, the skills, there are really strong arguments in favour of more migration in the EU. There's needs that the EU has around, as I said, an older population, needs carers. The UK, which really tightened up migration from the EU after Brexit, now has a crisis in care because we don't have cheaper Polish workers delivering care. And that's because of the migration issue, right? The problem is, though, and I was involved in quite a big project at the European level to try and advocate for migration, for more migration in the EU, and to try and find out what these debates were and why they weren't getting through. You have a national level where people sometimes they're a bit cagey about it. Increasingly now, they're more happy to be explicitly anti-migrant. But often that's couched against a broader debate of an international nature, which limits how much they can say that. But it's when you get to local politics, when people are talking about, I can't get a school place, or I can't get a place in my hospital, or I can't get a house, and they start to look at people who look different for them, who've got access to those services, that's where it gets really significant, right? And that's often not anything to do with migrants, right? That's to do with the collapse in welfare services, or school places, or the economy's not delivering. And those are broader issues which aren't addressed effectively by the European level. They're very much national level. And I think one of the issues that the European Union has as a challenge is getting beyond the national level debate on these kind of issues, because the national level debate tends to prevail. People tend to trust the national level more, and that frames nation over other, right? And that inevitably precipitates more anti-migrant debate. So I think the EU can do more. So I have been involved in we've just put in for a load of money to try and do another project, which is try and subvert the. So in Italy, you've got an anti-immigrant leadership at the moment, and they put real constraints on how many refugees can come into Italy. But I do quite a lot of stuff on small business policy. One of the things they've said is that we can have migrants if there's a skill need, if the economy needs it. So what we've done is we've talked to some SMEs in in a part of Italy called Emilia-Romagna. There's a group of SME organisations that we talked to. They've helped us identify some SME needs, and then we set up some training organisations in Egypt who are going to train them up so that we can say, well, look, here we go. And then those people who've come to Egypt can also gain additional skills to go into other parts of Europe, or people can come to Egypt, get trained up and move on. That's what we're trying to do. And that's using a legal loophole, right? It's a loophole. It's not a main policy. So you can do things which subvert, but mainly that's quite difficult to sustain. So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, you got 3 more questions. How exciting. Brilliant. 4 more. Okay.
So I have 2 questions to you. First is that how do you see Turkey's rising contestation of in EU? And second question is that you mentioned that EU is generating the money from its colonies and other unfair trade practices to distribute it in its members. So if EU is not going to generate this kind of revenue and is having trouble in generating this revenue, then what will be the next alternative to flourish its members with?
Excellent question. So could you just say the first question again? I didn't. You said something about a rise in the EU. What was it?
Yeah. It's Turkey's rising contestation of EU. Turkey's target the EU's legitimacy by highlighting its failure to impartially uphold the moral duties and citizens within.
So was that Turkey? Did you say the country Turkey?
Yeah.
The country Turkey.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So Turkey's really interesting. Because it's very close to the EU, it's a big economy. It trades quite a lot with the EU. I did a project in 2007, 2008 on promoting EU policy in Turkey because we thought, or the British government who funded the project thought that Turkey could join, right? And that was the UK's foreign policy agenda was America, obviously, and then the second thing was Turkey into the EU. So it was a really big project, and we trained 700 people in how to understand how to match European policy. It was an interesting kind of exercise. But what we forgot, what the British government forgot about, was Greece, right? So Greece and Turkey never get on, right? And you can see that in a number of ways. It's because of the Ottoman Empire controlled Greece for quite a long time. And then if you go to Cyprus, which is quite an important strategic island in the Mediterranean, half of it's controlled by Greece, half of it's owned by Turkey. Now, Greece will never let Turkey join. And it's something which has been reproduced again and again through Greek education. So I used to get students from Cyprus coming over to study at LEEDS, a European Studies degree. I knew what the dissertation was going to be about every single time. It was always around Turkish accession, always. And it's something which has filtered into some of the EU agenda as well. So you have seen a Christian rhetoric being used to push against Turkish access. But that was in 2007, 2008. Since then, Erdogan has become a very powerful figure in Turkish politics, and he's not really interested in Turkey joining the EU. It's very unlikely that it would happen. As an economic power, though, Turkey's become very significant. And as a regional power, you can see it being far more significant and more flexible. So I think the EU has to accommodate Turkey in different ways and be more clever about that. But it's a good question. Your second question was about trade partnership and post-colonial or colonial links and legacies. France is still Africa's biggest banker, right? So no change there, really. The UK's strategy after Brexit was called Global Britain, which is basically trying to be 19th century Britain, but without all the guns and tanks. And it was meant to be a charm offensive. But it didn't really work. The promise to the British people was that everyone in the world would want to come and trade with Britain. But of course, Britain's not as big as the European Union. The European Union is the biggest, wealthiest market in the world, right? And if you're trying to make a trade deal with the European Union, you're going to go there before you go to Little Britain. So there's a real issue about Britain and how it perceives itself, especially around that Brexit debate. I think the big issue is that it hasn't really resolved those issues. I think the lack of debate about that point is really, really remarkable, right? There's no real acknowledgement of the legacy of empire and of colonialism in welfare infrastructure in Europe. And I think that's a massive problem. And you can see that in Belgium, people are pushing against it. In Germany and France, you get response, which is often quite a racially charged debate. And so I think, you know, what the European Union could do is be more progressive in terms of its trade policy. It's one of the biggest donors in the world, but so China's massive on that as well. And those donations tend to be about sustaining unequal development rather than raising up other economies to have equal access. It's still very difficult for non-European countries to trade directly with the EU on products which have got added value on them. It tends to be privileged. It tends to privilege raw materials, which is obviously lower value. So I think there's things changing, but an awful lot has to be done before that wrong can be righted. And I don't see the EU having an effective strategy to deal with that, let alone what the implications of that would be for welfare. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, a couple of other people. Yes.
Excuse me.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
It's just questions. I'm sure that students are having questions. We'll continue with the sessions. We can have the question answer sessions at 12:45 to 12:55. 10 minutes I'm going to give you for the questions at the end. So please note down your questions. Yes, all the delegates will be answering your questions. Please bear with us and because we have other speakers to speak. So you can jot down the questions. Dr. Charlie, I'm intervening. I'm really sorry because we'll have the question answer session, sure. But at 12:45, we'll have the question answer session. For 10 minutes, we'll open the floor for the question answer session. They can all have the questions written down clearly for each spokespersons, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
So if you could just state modified and sorry, talk. I'm so sorry, no, just.
Thank you, Dr. Dandratha, for your insights. We are privileged to welcome Dr. Papia Mazumdar to deliver her lecture on a crucial topic, climate change and health in India. Dr. Mazumdar joined University of Leeds in February 2022 as a lecturer in global health. She holds a PhD in population studies from Indian International Institute of Population Sciences, India, and has an extensive experience in postgraduate teaching and research supervision across diverse multidisciplinary fields, including social, medical, and basic sciences. Her research interest focuses on global health policy with a particular emphasis on nexus between climate change, environmental factors, and population health outcomes, specifically in low and middle income countries. Her research has primarily explored the development and health impacts on populations in low lying coastal regions of South Asia, examining how fragile livelihoods respond to climate change and extreme weather events. By applying mixed method research approaches, Dr. Mazumdar has studied the geographical and infrastructural constraints that increase health risk in these regions and coping strategies for employed these affected populations. Please welcome Dr. Mazumdar to deliver her lecture.
Hello, everyone. Once again, hi. Yeah. So this is Papia, and I look Indian. I am Indian. So the kind of, the departure from Charlie would be quite distinct. So from European Union, here we are in India, right? And my talk today will actually touch upon one of the greatest crises possibly we are meeting today, and you can feel it day in and day out, right? So that's the climate impacts on our health. Yeah, very simple. And do we need to stimulate politics and institutional engagement? Okay, so I do have basically a Mentimeter survey, but I don't know whether you would be able to sort of get that right. So if I just don't do it, you can scan it, you can put your input, but I'm not sure whether it will work. So if I can just go there and see, so the questions put on there is basically, do you feel affected by weather on a daily basis? Or generally, do you ever feel that weather is affecting your daily life? So can I get the hands, please, for yes? Who thinks yes? Yeah, I feel affected by weather on my daily. Well, not many, right? Okay. So can I get some questions for, some answers for how does it affect you? Some kind of, few, one or two. If you can shout out, please. Those who just raised hand, can you just tell me how it is affecting, how weather is affecting your daily life? It can be drastic, yeah? Sorry, I can't hear you quite clearly. Can somebody give her a mic, please?
The increasing heat day by day is really posing threat to my skin as well as others and health as well.
Yeah, so the skin you think is getting affected. Any other physical or mental health aspects to you? Yeah, please put the mic. Emotions can change. Wonderful answer from this young lady. Okay, all right. Any other response? Okay, so let us just see that what we have in our Indian headlines from recent periods, right? So you can see whole loads of information that's being kind of projected headlines almost every day, wherein sea level has risen in South Asia or Asia much higher than was expected. We have floods in Manali, right from Himalayas until Kerala, right from northeastern states to Gujarat. We can really see the kind of spread of climate impacts that we are heading to, right? We get heat stress, we get floods, we get extensive excess rainfall, prolonged heat stress period, and so on. You name it, and we all possibly have experienced in the recent years. even though you haven't raised your hand and said that I'm getting affected by weather on my daily life. Okay, all right, that reality is yes, we are getting affected. So the recent flood situation, some of these, as we can kind of, we know that in Kerala, what has happened. And the area, the ecological area of Enad has been kind of warned by Madhav Gadgil and the experts panel that it's so fragile, it just can't sustain. And we kept on extending whatever economic activities and development we had, we could do. And there indeed that we have experienced that devastating, disaster that in July and August that we have just experienced. Floods in Manipur, in May, you could imagine that kind of, I don't know whether you follow, I mean, across different states, yeah, of course, our students from Northeastern India would relate to the kind of devastations and the horror that we have experienced in Manipur regarding the flood this May, right? We have right now several of these places in India where we are experiencing flood. And one of that is in West Bengal. And you can very well see that, how it has kind of impacted. Catastrophic flood in Andhra Pradesh. Somebody from Andhra Pradesh would relate that what I mean here. So you can really find that, all sorts of climate events, excessive rainfall and hazards are actually affecting. So we have actually a lot more to think about how we would actually respond to the health consequences that we are facing at the moment from heat, from excess rainfall, floods, drought, and so on. But have you heard of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC? How many of you have heard of IPCC as an institution? Of course, our faculty members will, but rest of the students, have you heard of IPCC, right? And they have been kind of saying that vulnerability to climate change is a combination of factors, okay? Now, the factors are exposure to the hazard risk, okay, which is very different for different people, depending on geolocation of yours, wherever you are seeing. Susceptibility, which is also sensitivity because of your physiological health and whatever makeup you have as an individual, and also adaptive capacity. So it's a combination of things you can think about right from individual until the institutional interventions and the infrastructure and all sorts of environment that is supported by the country government and the state government that you are in. So most often what has happened is actually, these most affected people are from marginalized sections of the society. And of course, they are not heard enough, right? Their kind of effect is not hard enough. So that's the reason possibly in this whole entire climate impact on health actually boils down to the fact, are we actually responding to these needs and the equity that is embedded as a underlying kind of, unresolved question in that whole entire hazards that we are facing today. So I'm sorry because there are too many, it feels like there are too many. So, so should I just stop? Are there people joined online? Yeah, okay. So, all right. So what I want to say that, your experiences of, I have just shared few of these, my, text, but people are really thinking, were you there in Delhi in August when you had, in May and June, where you had recorded about 50-degree centigrade? Were you there? So how it felt like? Some people said it was almost surreal, yeah? So some people said that it didn't only affect my physiological health, but also mentally, because I didn't know what to do. Some people said that though I'm in air-conditioned area, it never worked. So all these people never knew that this will happen, and it is happening. Even in other parts of the world, I was just learning from Qatar, Yeah, you know that small country in Middle East, Qatar, and they're saying that it almost feels like outdoor never exists. So every life activities you do, even jogging, your physical exercises, you are doing it indoor. Okay, so malls, big malls are just opening up just for people demarcated for doing their exercises. So is this the world we hoped for? Is this the development that we really think that will take us anywhere as a world together? Not only kind of, we are achieving, I mean, what kind of climate we are looking at, what kind of development we are expecting and awaiting for. And you can very well see that put like, kind of projection, climate forecast on Indian map, almost 90% of India is actually sitting on excess heat area. They have been identified as having excess heat in the coming years. So you can really can't, I mean, you can very well imagine that you can't escape this heat. So what did we do as environmental kind of, environmentalism in India? We had a Green Party, but in the Europe, I think Green Party is a major thing. In India, we don't have that much like, Green Party presence, but we do have a Green Party already registered with Election Commission of India, but we can see very little happening from their side. But if you just go back to 1972, wherein our, Honorable Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, actually put a very important kind of point where like poverty is the worst polluter. Now, everything around environmentalism actually started from there. So just get rid of poverty and environmental problems will be resolved. So we just went after development and development, wherein sometimes mindless. We are actually building on hills. We are building a this big buildings and other things. But really, we are not seeing that how those development and infrastructure will get supported by the terrain and the conditions that those places are having. So, but despite we had numerous developmental agenda coming up over the years from last 50 years, but also you can very well see that there has been environmental protest groups. Civil society have been kind of saying that for a long time that we are not doing the right thing. And you can very well see the list of I've just kind of put out here for your kind of recollection of memory that we had kind of quite active civil society groups, this thing. So have you heard of the word Anthropocene? Anybody? Anthropocene? Yeah, so Shashi Tharoor has just come up with his new book, Wonderful World of Words or something. And therein he has put in 101 words that have just come up. And one of the words majorly over the last 10 years or so has been Anthropocene. So any idea what Anthropocene is? Anybody? No? Okay. So the thing is when, have you heard of historian Dipesh Chakraborty? Professor Dipesh Chakraborty. And yes, and he's been kind of, quite pursuing the idea of Anthropocene, wherein we come as geological force to impact on our environment and geology to a very active way, okay? So we have never been human beings, human beings have never been so active, but since the Industrial Revolution, which has started around, say, 1815 onwards, we can really see the acceleration of these force being active on changing world's climate and geology. So that's the reason that we become so important. Our activities every day become so important living in this Anthropocene. So how do we kind of get rid of these mess that we have created for ourselves? So disaster resilience framework from United Nations 6, there are 7 steps, major steps that you can see. So have you heard of Sendai framework of disaster risk resilience, and you can very well see how that is flowing up. Now, I did, with my understanding of equity in mind, that climate issues ultimately boils down to the justice issues and equity issues. I was just doing a little bit of field work this summer in heat across different parts of West Bengal and northern India. And my first location was in Pathar Pratima Sundarbans area, one of my long time study location, which is bordering Bangladesh, and it just flows to the delta region of South Bengal. And this is what I see there, that the man's existence is very much within water. Okay, so you can't think Sundarbans without thinking of man living next to the water. Now, how do you not get affected if something happens with cyclone? Yeah, and every year we can really see that monsoon, pre-monsoon cyclones are building up, more accelerated and more severe and intense in their nature just because of this global warming. Yeah, so we need to really think about how water and health in those areas are going to get affected. Okay, so I'll move on to the next location I visited, which is it's a little far ahead on the north, and again in West Bengal state. And it's an area where people are saying that this is possibly the Asia's biggest coal mine. So that hasn't been explored as of now. Have you heard of Deutscha Pachami? So the area you have heard of. And people are saying that, well, there's a basalt layer on the top, but as you go down, you'll find that there are coals to be explored. So it's a big investment proposal coming from Indian government to open up these new coal mines and being kind of signed up for, okay? Now, what I learned from there, the traditional communities, mostly lived by the tribal communities therein, they are actually, having a lot of say about how, if this is a coal mine, it's a new coal mine opened up tomorrow, so how they should be compensated for their lands, because they have to sort of move away from this, evacuate that, their family lands and everything. So a lot of questions being raised around how the benefit package will actually not be unjustified. So it should justify people's sacrifice. But there is very little agency on the nature. Yeah. So how natural, the nature will be protected and under these conditions, and there's very little conversation going on. So these are some of the photo from there, and you can very well see that the basalt is being kind of excavated from the basalt quarry, stone quarries, and they're getting converted into stone chips. We use it for several purposes, and you can see that kind of health problems that can actually cause. So my third location was a hill area in Kashiong. Have you heard of Kashiong? Is a hill location in northern side of West Bengal. And there it's a Trans-Himalayan region, and you can very well see that how fragile is the environment and the ecology and the geology is. And ecotourism in the recent years have actually taken a huge lot of interest from state government of West Bengal. And you can see that the pictures that I have just shown you here, that always there will be sort of, the collapse of hills, and some parts will be inaccessible and so on. And it just goes on during monsoons to a large extent. A lot of problem with health, water, there are a lot of sanitation issues and so on. You name the few. Now, this is a part in Haryana, Sonipat, and we have been kind of visiting those tracks as well. And you can very well see it's part of this agroclimatic zone called Indo-Gangetic, Trans-Gangetic Plain, basically. And you can see that there are water stresses being kind of observed in the recent years. You can also see that how water and health can affect. Huge issues we could find from the access to health centers. So the problem is like if somebody is struck by the heat stress, how that person will be taken to the nearest health center, we don't know. So a lot of infrastructure issues that comes up very pertinently. So who would take this agency, by the way? Yeah, who do you think should think about all practical everyday thing? Is this a hand that is bought, or is this a hand, the person in the back? Okay, all right. I'm just like, think about the civil society and electorates, right? Do we have to think that what will be our future? Does our media really reflect those things that can actually affect our psyche and our conversation and our discourses? And does our political party, yeah, all of them, right? So what electorate think? We had, kind of a study that had come up in Nature very recently. Study says that, so communication must be going on about the scientific consensus around climate change. So people should know what consensus being kind of made on the evidence that are produced, right? Globally, not just in India, okay? And climate change should not be, in communication, should not go as a polar bear kind of hanging from a falling, iceberg, but it should actually tell you how you are getting affected. So personal relevance is the key to get to people's psyche. Do you feel that there is an urgency almost today? We need to resolve some of these issues which are pending from long. So there is a sense of urgency, okay? So those kind of pertinence, relevance coming from the personal relevance has to be brought into that communication. So we had a Deloitte survey in 2024. Have you heard of Gen X and Millennium surveys? Yeah, possibly yes. And you could see that, how people are, young people in this world, largest and youngest country, possibly are thinking about. So yes, they feel stressed about climate change issues. Do you feel stressed about climate change issues? Possibly, yes, right? What will happen? You are following Greta Thunberg, possibly, but there are many Greta Thunberg in this country who are really thinking of, how these issues would be resolved. However, we also need to be more scientific in our approach to get to the, electorate in that matter. So if I just can, go back to our mainstream politics, in our media, and there are studies which are shown, like for a number of databases taken together, that in media, we are being quite vocal, especially print English media, right? We are being vocal about incidences that are happening. Regional media might be actually reflecting a lot on extreme incidences happening in this country. But we sometimes, go out of the radar just because of the language, because India has about, how many? 29 regional language. Is that right? 29 regional language, yeah? And they do have all, regional media and print media. So you can very well see that everything happening regionally and being reflected, but possibly we are not capturing that. So we need to sort of reporting that should come up. But what happens to our politics? Did you vote in Lok Sabha election 24, all of you? So how was the voting day? Polling day? Was it too hot for you to sort of come out? Yeah. And were there enough arrangement put in place in the polling booth that were everybody says, no, they were not. In fact, yes. And that caused such a massacre. Some of our polling officers, they died. Can you just imagine? But if you just go back, track the information communication, you see, IMD has been kind of warning that we are heading a prolonged heat stress in April, May, June. Nobody paid a heed to it. Can you imagine how callous we can be? We had, taking on this forecast, We had opportunity to save some lives, right? We had opportunities to take care of people's health. We didn't do that. So we say that our voters doesn't like talking about climate change and other things like, the unemployment, development, all are hot topics. And that's what we land up into in our election rallies and so on. But do we really not vote, or are we not being heard enough that we really need to solve this problem? So I think we need to question ourselves as electorate, but our political parties also need to recognize the need of the hour, which hasn't been quite, it hasn't come as a wake-up call as of now. And I really can't understand this kind of, disconnect between information being flowed from that high-level IMD sort of institution, wherein political parties are quite unprepared to deal with all that, even during this largest democratic operations that we had in LS, this thing. So this is kind of, it looks like a solar system, but I thought that the sun is basically here, the equity and climate issues in the center, in the very core. And you can very well see the kind of health problems. You'll get the slides, so don't worry about the font sizes and all. You can have a look at the slides even later on. And you can very well see that how, our adaptation issues, our mitigation issues will actually merge into the kind of problem that we are having today to sort of solve climate justice and health issues, to be fair. So what we do in LEEDS, because these kind of problems, global challenges are so complex. So we try to sort of ignite these young minds through our curriculum. Okay, so LEEDS is going through a lot of changes in our curriculum, which is called Curriculum Redefined program. And we are trying to sort of see how these different branches, because we are trying to break this interdisciplinary, we are becoming interdisciplinary all the more. And we are trying to sort of get away from disciplinary training, basically. Yeah. So we are trying to redefine our curriculum, how that interdisciplinarity can be maximized to benefit our students' training and experiences going forward. So Charlie and we all are from Faculty of Social Sciences. Charlie and I come from School of Politics and International Studies. And Peter, my colleague, comes from Social Policy, School of Social Policy, which is very much under the same faculty, which is Faculty of Social Sciences. And in police, we in short form, we call it Politics and International Studies. We have 4 BA programs. You can very well see that. And all BA programs possibly somewhere touch upon these, challenges of global development challenges and other things in various ways. Charlie just mentioned so many dimensions about international and international relations and politics, and I work with a global development team. So there are whole range of expertise that goes around. And in our master's program, we do have huge loads, and again multidisciplinary kind of programs that we are coming up. We're also coming up in the 2025 online program of MSc in Global Health, which might interest you, because it just you'll have this perspective of clinical as well as social science perspective in global health, all combined under the same program, and it's flexible because it's online. So this is to just give you an idea that beyond these academic programs, our students are also being challenged and kind of questions and intrigued by the center. We have 7-8 centers within police, and you have this opportunity to sort of interact with different groups that are working on different aspects. And University of Leeds have cross-cutting kind of institutions like Horizon Institute and Center for Climate Futures, Priestley Center for Climate Futures, and so on, wherein our students have huge opportunity to interact with world leaders who are thinking about climate change and several aspects of its impact on population. So this is what possibly in Anthropocene we have come up, right? Just to sort of wrap up my this thing. Can you recognize one of these big landfills almost touching Himalayas height? Yeah, in and around Delhi. So this is how we deal with our waste, our own waste generation. And I was also visiting this place, as I said, Kashyong, and I could see that, they have collected from upstream the plastics that ecotourism has generated. So they just put it for the demonstration and exhibition. And the other one, the meandering course of Tista, what I found was like, with our intervention, human intervention and encroachment, we are actually creating a lot more hindrance for Tista to flow. But the problem is like, these humongous river like Tista will actually change her course in course of time, just because that is so powerful as geological force, right? Nothing human is nothing, and you have heard about the Tista, the gulf that has happened in the last year. So I'll just put this thought before I go to you. So I was visiting Sundarban, as I said. So the picture you see is actually the soft clay soil, which is transported by river and being kind of, put on the bank. It's so soft that raindrops can make mark. Okay, have you seen ever that raindrops is making mark on the earth? You haven't possibly, right? Pause a little bit and see how that can happen if you happen to be in such a soft area. And then you can see enormous number of footprint on that, right? Small mollusks, small creatures, insects, wherever they go, they're making their footprints. But the biggest one, who is actually making, and if you just look at this area, these are human footprints, because we are so heavy in our footprints, right? So I'll just stop here, and the questions maybe we take later on, as kindly said by this thing. I hope my entire purpose is just to put a note in your mind that we need to act now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mazumdar, for your insights. We are now privileged to welcome Dr. Peter Doak to deliver a lecture on contested memory at historical conflict sites. Dr. Doak is lecturer in sociology at School of Sociology and Social Policy, University of Leeds, since September 2018. His area of expertise include urban sociology, cultural policy, violent conflict, conflict transformation, widening participation in higher education. Prior to Leeds, he held positions at Ulster University and Queen's University Belfast, where he completed his PhD in sociology. As Deputy Director of Student Education Enhancement, Dr. Doak is committed to increasing diversity within the student body and implementing initiatives aimed at improving retention, progression, and reducing award gaps for non-traditional students. Please welcome Dr. Peter Doak to deliver his address.
Is it in the pen drive? Meal makes me. No, it wasn't on the pen. I sent it to you. Yeah. Hello? Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Can everyone understand me okay? I have a slightly different accent than some of our other speakers today. Can anyone guess my accent?
Irish. Hooray for the Irish. The greatest country in the world, apart from India. The second greatest country in the world. Okay, today we're just taking a moment to set up the presentation. I'm going to speak to you about tourism. I'm going to speak to you about a very particular kind of tourism, a tourism that is sometimes referred to as dark tourism. Has anyone heard of that concept before? Dark tourism. Okay, I'll explain what dark tourism means as we go through today's session. And if we have time, we'll apply some of the kind of theoretical concepts from the beginning of the lecture to a variety of case studies from around the world. The reason that I'm kind of walking around here is I always feel a little bit uncomfortable standing in front of a lectern, but hopefully I don't seem too much like a rock star kind of walking up and down here. Hopefully you can still concentrate on what I'm saying. Okay, are we ready to make a start? Thanks very much. Okay, so what I want to do to begin with is to guess the numbers. I don't know if you can quite make out the images on the screen. This is a picture I chose for you guys. Does anybody know what the picture is? Taj Mahal. Now I'm led to believe that's not far from here. Is that right? And it's in, is it Agra? Agra, okay. So this is my symbol of tourism, but I want to think globally about tourism. How many tourists do we think there are in the world? When did tourism begin? What percentage of jobs worldwide are dependent on tourism? So let's start with the when did mass tourism begin? I want you to shout out the answer. Shout it out loud and proud. Come on. I can't hear anyone shouting. Okay, you can raise your hands and tell me if that's easier, if that's more polite. Anyone? Is everybody feeling a little bit shy? Is that what's wrong? Are we too embarrassed to shout it out? Okay. Right, in that case, we'll move swiftly on to the next slide. What I would say is that mass tourism, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Although, to quote Zygmunt Bauman, tourists and vagabonds have always existed, it is only in recent times that we have this concept of mass tourism. And by that, I mean that a significant proportion of the global population are now involved in travel of some sort or another. Really, it was from the 1960s onwards that we had the development of international mass tourism. And this was when significant numbers of people left their own country of domicile, their own country of residence, to travel to other countries in search of some sort of pleasure. This image, not quite as nice as the Taj Mahal. Can you see it? Okay, this image, it symbolizes over-tourism in a part of Spain called Mallorca. Has anyone heard of Mallorca? Yeah? Mallorca, a very beautiful island off the coast of mainland Spain, and one of the first places to be developed as a mass tourist resort. This image of a slightly overweight white man, it kind of captures the fact that it's traditionally people from Northern Europe who go in search of the sun. And when they go, they cause various kinds of infrastructural problem as well. From the 2000s onwards, even more recently then, there has been a growth of tourism from Asian countries towards the rest of the world. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. Given the populations involved in Asia, what's the population of India? 1.4 billion people. And what's the population of China? Okay, so India wins the population, but what we're talking about is 1/3 of the world's population. So as they become more likely to become involved in migration, there could be significant issues involved in this also. That being said, tourism is vital to the functioning of the world economy. Globally, it supports 1 in 10 jobs. So 10% of all jobs in the world are in some ways linked to tourism. And interestingly, from a sociological perspective, tourism is much more than a kind of straightforward process. It's a combined political and cultural process, as well as being simply about the movement of people. And this is what I want to begin to talk about today as we touch upon the idea of dark tourism. Okay, I should say that we were encouraged to link our lectures today to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Has everyone heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? So the one that I chose was about promoting peace and promoting sustainable and more kind of sturdy institutions. And what I wanted to ask today is if tourism to sites associated with historical conflict could in some way help promote peace and the stability of institutions. But we're going to approach this in a highly critical way, so bear with me. Okay, so the first concept we need to understand if we're to think about this kind of tourism, it comes from someone who's originally a geographer called John Urey. Has anyone heard of this person? He coins the term the tourist gaze. Have you heard of the tourist gaze? Okay, the tourist gaze itself is a development from another major French social theorist, Michel Foucault. Have we heard of Foucault? And Foucault talks about the gaze as a kind of form of power. To gaze upon someone is to exert power upon it. And it's tied up to this notion of governmentality, whereby when we feel that this power has been cast upon us, we act in very particular ways. We basically suppress our agency. We're not free to do what we want. We try and correspond to that which we believe the gaze is imposing on us. Does this sound familiar so far? Vaguely. Come on, work with me here. Okay, brilliant. So tourist gaze then implies that when the tourist looks upon a place, that place has to be remade to correspond to the vision, to the desired normative vision which the tourist expects of a place. And very often this means an entire reworking of a landscape to try and make it more, appeal more to what it is that the tourist isn't an individual person. The tourist here is a metaphor, for tourism per se, what they want it to look like. Does this make sense? And this is sometimes referred to as anti-mimesis. This is the idea that art does not imitate life, but rather life itself imitates art. I think that's the right way around. To quote the great Irish writer, does anybody know who first said that? Oscar Wilde. Have you heard of Oscar Wilde? Good. My personal hero. Okay, so this is the idea that in response to what it is that tourists are expected to see when they go upon, entire areas are remade, they're physically reconstructed, they're cleaned up, they're beautified, they're done up in various ways to make sure that they impress the tourists. Does all of this make sense so far? Okay. And this reminds me, this is going slightly off topic, but there's a very famous anecdote. Has anyone here ever watched a movie? It's from, I think, the late 1980s, 1990s, called Braveheart. Braveheart, the story of Scotland fighting against the wicked English. Yeah, we've all seen it, and he cries, "Freedom!" Is that right? Guy with a slightly dodgy mullet. Okay, when they were filming, this is a big Hollywood movie, and the Hollywood executives, producers came all the way from Los Angeles to Scotland to look for sites where they could film it. And when they got there, they said it was no good. Nowhere looked like Scotland, even though they were in Scotland. So what they decided to do, they couldn't remake the entirety of Scotland for that, is significant proportions of that film are in fact filmed in Ireland instead. Because for the directors, for the consumer gaze, Ireland in fact looked more like Scotland than Scotland did. So this is the level of inauthenticity we're occasionally talking about. And again, it ties back to notions of sort of Disneyfication. This is the idea that in a geographic sense, whole aspects of space can be kind of created in this hyper-real way, to quote the French social theorist Baudrillard, to make them illusions, but better kind of copies of reality itself. Okay? And there is some debate about the extent to which Disneyfication occurs. Okay, so we've conceptualized tourism, and we've talked about the idea that tourism involves often the recreation of places to correspond to the tourist gaze. So what then is this notion of dark tourism? Well, dark tourism, there's some debate about its kind of origins, where it comes from. Rojac, writing in 1993, noted that there was something of a fatal attraction which he regarded as a condition of postmodernity. What this means is he saw something in the late modern or the postmodern kind of mindset that was concerned with the public interest a model in public interest in death itself. Some years later, this idea was developed into the notion of dark tourism, and it's pitted against its kind of its alternative conceptualization, which is thanatourism. So thanatourism, which was coined by Seaton, refers to any tourism which is linked in some ways to death. Now, one of the things we're probably aware is that this is not actually a new phenomenon. There have been historic pilgrimages to religious sites. There have been historical movements to battlefields, things like this. And there have been, in the case again of Oscar Wilde, millions of people over the years have gone to see his grave in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Has anyone been? It's absolutely fantastic, fantastic day out. And as you can see, this is a picture of his grave. People come and kiss the grave, and they kiss it with the idea being that this somehow brings them closer to the famous writer. Now, in many ways, although all of these things are associated with death, there's nothing particularly dark about them per se. There's nothing particularly morbid about going to see Oscar Wilde's grave. Certainly, I didn't feel that way when I went to see it. So again, Lennon and Foley have developed the idea of thanatourism to come up instead with the notion of dark tourism, something which is the other of light. It's not just death. There's something sinister about it. Dark tourism then is a form of thanatourism, so tourism which is concerned with death, that has particularly sinister connotations. Are we okay with that? Brilliant. So here's an image from just outside the city of Leeds. This is a quaint little village, the kind that you might have seen on TV in an historic drama. This is the village of Haworth. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where some very famous literary sisters, the Bronte sisters, so they're buried nearby here. And again, I don't know how well you can see the image, but in theory, there's nothing dark or sinister about going to their graves. And yet, as you can see, well, hopefully you could see from the image, their graves are in fact quite sinister enough kind of place. This looks like something, to my mind, out of a ghost movie. The kind of place where ghosts will come up and terrify you. But according to that strict conceptualization, this is not a form of dark tourism. This would be a form of thanatourism. Okay? Are we okay? Yeah, okay. Okay. Before we move any further on, the other concept I want to talk to you about is the idea of dissonant heritage. In some ways, all heritage is contested. There are always battles over heritage. So heritage, in its simplest sense, is that which we remember. It's a history that is remembered. Not all history is remembered. Every day there are things happening which will never be written down. No one will ever remember that they happened. Even though they have consequence, they will not necessarily be remembered. Heritage is those very selective parts of human history or of natural history which we choose to remember. And remembering in this sense can be multifaceted. I don't simply mean in a cognitive sense like the psychologist would mean, that this stuff is somehow stored in the back of our minds. By remembering, I mean something which is much more active than that. It could be performative. Again, I'm guessing that people in this room have at some stage in their life taken part in a performative act of remembering, where you've gone along to a festival, for example, a commemoration, and you're encouraged to participate in some way. Have we all done that? Okay. And again, this could be linked to nationalism, it could be linked to religion, it could be linked to any number of kind of aspects that we're expected to remember. Heritage can also be preservative. And what I mean about this is it can be about the conservation of physical sites. It can be about trying to make sure that a physical site is not lost, it does not crumble, it does not, get washed away by the sea. It is not affected by global warming. There's all kinds of attempts at preserving physical heritage at sites where sea level is risking them. Okay? But it can also be representational. And by representational, we mean the conversion of this into a very particular form of narrative, a representational narrative, which can be linguistic, which can be discursive, which can be visual. But it's basically that translation of a narrative into an image or a discourse. Crucially then, heritage is always partial and it's always selective. The precise parameters of what is being remembered stem from an interplay of political, social, and economic factors. Okay, it's not natural that anything is remembered. It's always an outcome of these kind of contestations. And where this becomes particularly problematic is at sites which pertain to historical conflict. And by conflict, I mean violent conflict. The kind of conflict which often takes the form of military battles, genocides, mass executions, imprisonments, these kind of things. These are what we're interested here. So it obviously takes on a particular resonance when we're talking about the contestation and the remembrance of such sites and what it means for a particular form of tourist, people engaged in dark tourism, to come to sites associated with these kind of atrocities. And that's what I want us to think about for the final part of this session. Is this making sense so far? Do you promise me you're not lying? Brilliant. Okay. And can you hear me? I feel really self-conscious with this microphone. Can you hear what I'm saying? Everyone? Okay, brilliant. Aha. Right. So this brings us back to the notion not just of the tourist gaze, whereby things are reconfigured to appeal to the gaze, remember, of the tourist. The entirety of the physicality or the representation of the world has changed. Scotland is switched to Ireland to try and make it look more Scottish. So too, this happens at some of these dark sites. So we're talking about sites associated with war, disaster, massacres. Now, tourism to such sites, like tourism itself, it's not new. In fact, a lot of the theorists of this point out that historically most tourism was concerned with death in some ways. It was absolutely normal to visit sites where people had been massacred, sites of historic battles, tombs of people who had been slain. Writing in one of their articles, one of the authors cited here noted that as soon as a particular battle in the American Civil War had been fought, somebody purchased the rights to set up a museum the very next day on the site of that, because they thought this was sort of heritage that was going to be made. So there's a long kind of history of this. But I suppose where it becomes a problem is that in some ways, dark tourism is the fastest growing sector of tourism, globally speaking. Now, bear in mind those numbers I talked about. Huge numbers of people, 1 billion tourists a year, 1 in 10 jobs dependent upon it. And if this fastest growing sector is concerned with death, concerned with atrocities, concerned with murder, then we really need to start thinking about the kind of ethics and moral questions involved in representing this and what kind of stories are told and to what ends. Okay? So, remember the idea here is that much like any tourism, if tourism to dark sites, quote unquote, are to be successful, then the sites themselves need to correspond to what we imagine. So I've got an image here. I don't know if any of you will be able to guess this. This is a kind of classic dark tourism image, but it's one that's not considered particularly controversial. Has anyone been to London? Anyone? London? Has anyone been to East London, Whitechapel? Scene of the Whitechapel murders. Have you heard of the Whitechapel murders? Those grisly murders where Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of East London. So if you go there nowadays, Whitechapel has been entirely redeveloped. It's all new, shiny buildings. It's considered a fairly affluent part, gentrified part of London, but it's full of these Jack the Ripper tours where you can follow in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. So that's what the kind of image relates to them. Now, in itself, in some ways, that is a contested kind of heritage. A lot of people make the point that it's wrong that we remember the name of Jack the Ripper. We do not remember the name of the victims. The victims are not kind of given that level of dignity. Mainly because they were women. They were women who were considered immoral. They were working as prostitutes. It tells us quite a lot about the kind of balance of power historically in that area in terms of gender. When we move to even more kind of controversial sites involved in major historical events that have perhaps led to political change, the contestations become even more extreme. And the question is, should this tourist gaze be cast upon such sites? Should traumatic histories be subject to commodification? That's one of the other things here. I've kind of glossed over the fact that this is an economic process. Money is to be made from these sites, huge quantities of money, as well as those political and cultural processes. Can such sites ever promote peace, or do they legitimate current power structures? I want to turn now to consider very briefly some case studies of this, if we've got time. How are we doing that? Okay. Can we have like 2 or 3 minutes? Just okay. I'll gloss or sorry, I'll try and get through this very quickly. Okay. Case 1, Tulslang Genocide Museum in Cambodia. Has anyone heard of it? Okay. So again, what happens here is this was a former concentration camp, essentially prison constructed within the grounds of the school, as part of a particular genocide that happened between 1975 to around about 1975. Numerous people were tortured and murdered here. What's interesting is almost instantly following the defeat of the Khmer Rouge, mostly by Vietnamese forces coming in, this site was very quickly taken, preserved, and it was due to be held as a museum. Initially, foreigners were the only people allowed to come to it. Local people, native people were not allowed to witness it. That has changed in recent times. Crucially, what happened is that a very particular, brutal form of exhibition was curated primarily by a Vietnamese commuter called My Lam, involving quite barbaric images of human skulls, really graphic images of suffering. And this was to show how evil the regime historically had been. Again, it raises lots of questions about the politics of representation. And unsurprisingly, this kind of narrative was used not only as a seeing is believing kind of message, but to legitimate the new government who came in, to say this must never happen again. Does that make sense? Okay. And so by inviting people to cast their gaze upon this, visitors are, in a way, kind of tacitly reproducing that power structure of the new regime, saying, we believe you, we have seen what happens, we understand the horrors of genocide. In my other 2 case studies, a very similar image occurs. I look at Auschwitz just before finishing up. Has everyone heard of Auschwitz-Birkenheim? Auschwitz, yeah. So this is probably one of the more famous kind of things. And if you ever go there, it's an awful, awful site. It tells the story of the Holocaust, which is widely considered one of the worst events in human history. That being said, it's also a major tourist site. Over 1 million people a year visit this site, and they're told very particular narratives. So when this site was first opened, it almost immediately opened by the USSR following the liberation of Poland. Initially, the story that was told was that this was a place where Polish citizens were being killed by Germans. And who saved those Polish citizens? The USSR. And how do we know this? Well, the evidence speaks for itself. Look at how evil the site is. Look at the concentration camps itself. As time went by, and particularly with the kind of, I suppose, fragmentation of some of the USSR's grip on Eastern Europe, the more familiar story emerged that this is not a place where Polish people were being killed. Who was getting killed at Auschwitz? Who? Okay, Jewish people. This is where Jews were being killed. And again, although a lot of those Jews were Polish Jews, the emphasis changes entirely the meaning of the site. And obviously this is somewhere that we see evoked in recent kind of political debates, including with regards to the war in the Middle East at the moment, where various sides are trying to grasp on to the kind of, to label others as being Nazis, as being trying to perpetrate thing. So if we go to this site and we see the evil associated with this, then we never want to be that Nazi. We never want to be the person who would commit such a kind of thing. And that's a very powerful narrative to be weaponized. This is my very final slide, I promise you, because I'm where I'm taking your time. So had I had time, I would have talked about the 3 case studies. Instead, I only touched upon 2. Interestingly, in these case studies, although they occur in very different regions of the world, so one of the ones I would have talked about was in Africa, one in Asia, one in Europe, there are commonalities. There are 3 very different genocides, but the remembering of the genocides, the process involved in the construction of heritage is quite similar. Okay, what we have in each of these is we have the collapse of what we might call plural meanings, a variety of different meanings, a variety of different histories into one single agreed historical narrative. We have the authenticity of seeing is believing. You cannot look at these sites and think that they are a lie somehow, think that they are not telling the truth. And this is despite the fact that we are suspending our disbelief. We know that these are highly curated, highly choreographed, highly selectively put together. And yet when we see them, we know what we're looking at and we believe it. In all of these cases, we also see the utilization of memory to buttress not only identity, but political hegemony and control of the future. So heritage in that sense is not neutral, it's not innocent, it's something which is very powerful and is linked to current political power and to control of future directions. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.
Floor is open for question and answer.
My question is to Peter, sir, that as you mentioned that the tourist places are being transformed as per the perspective of tourists. So what is it good in your perspective that transformation of these places will not lose their real possessions, their real heritage or not? What is your perspective? Is it negative or positive?
Can you hear me okay if I'm speaking through this? Because I've turned my microphone off and I don't know how to get it back on. Both and neither at the same time. These places are being transformed. They're being transformed through this kind of tourist gaze. On the one hand, it's good. I'm not saying it's bad that we remember the evils of a particular genocide. And I think it's good that people, when they visit a country, that they go and try and engage with a history of human suffering. This is part of a narrative as well. I suppose what I'm saying is that where it becomes problematic, as is so often the case, is when various actors seek to use that narrative to project and promote a very particular version of their own idea for the future. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? Does that answer the question, or would you like me to say more? That's okay, brilliant, thank you.
So my question is for Dr. Charlie. Following up on what you said, answering my previous question, dampening down the democracy means providing nation states with more autonomy, right? But you wouldn't want Austria putting up walls to keep out refugees, right? So you can't get rid of a democratic channel of communication between these nations, but you can improve it. So how would you suggest that the EU improve its ways of imparting, so to say, democracy? Thank you.
Hello. Okay, great. Another brilliant question. So this is I mean, there is one answer you could say. You've got to reformulate how you understand democracy, which is a bit of a cop out. But there are some things which have worked really well in the past, right? So one of the problems with the way that the EU manages its democracy is that it's very much about a liberal form of democracy, which is one which is about enabling people to move, enabling markets to move. But it's not about social redistribution. It's not about making sure that people who are not winning in those games are getting some resource. So one of the arguments could be to increase the amount of fiscal redistribution within the EU. You've got some areas of wealth, some areas of clear poverty, and they haven't been diminished, they've been exacerbated. In fact, you've got more polarity in wealth within Europe now and within countries within the EU than you've had in the past. So my point would be to strengthen the democratic mechanisms for allowing people to make decisions and to improve the tax farming to make sure that taxes get paid.
Hello. Yeah, another question would be that do you think that's holding the EU back is that they're ashamed of their colonial past? I mean, why not be more like Japan? They still haven't accepted their atrocities that they committed during the Second World War. So why not be more like that? I mean, they're far more developed. Maybe sometimes being, ashamed of your past can hold the EU back. Do you think that?
I think they do hold back. Yeah, I mean, I think that debate around the past and the present, which was just discussed really beautifully there, happens in all the EU member states. I mean, if you do travel around Europe, you'll see a very memorialized continent, right? There's places everywhere where people remember one war or another war. November the 11th every year, all around Europe, people remember the dead of the First World War and all other wars. It's a real ritual of Europeanness, but it relates to just the death of Europeans, and I don't think that that there's sufficient exploration of the consequences of Europe's colonial past, and I think that's because there's a political debate which doesn't progress to that level. I think if you just look at, say, the representation of voices within European politics, there's no representation of migration or of migrants. There's no representation of refugees. The Olympics was interesting. They had a refugee team, right? And they did quite well. It can be done. And those voices are important to just raise the issue so that people at least start thinking about them. But I think in Europe, it's so closed. It all tends to be around political parties, which are often based around that left-right cleavage and maybe some pushing against that. But generally, the EU political structures are fairly ossified. And I don't think that is productive. I think it does become one in which you just keep chasing your tail in the same way. And just the last thing, one way of creating better outcomes is to recognize, acknowledge, and learn how to forgive yourself for your past. Right. So there's no discussion of that, and you can't give yourself forgiveness until you at least acknowledge the harms that you've done. And I think those kind of issues are also creating kind of psychological traumas in European politics.
Thank you so much, sir. This would actually lead into my question for Dr. Peter. Like he said, you have to be proud of your past. You have to make sure that you're not ashamed of it. So you wouldn't categorize visiting Egypt to see the pyramids as dark tourism, right? Because they're proud of their past. They've made it so regal. They've made it royal that wouldn't be viewed as dark tourism, or would it be? Thank you.
I think that's a really good question. And the idea about dark tourism, it's not an official categorization per se. If you're visiting a lot of this comes down to kind of the agency and interpretation of the visitor also. If you're going to visit to gaze upon the kind of wonders of an ancient imperial Egyptian sort of glory age, then possibly. If you see the site is associated with being an actual tomb, then it starts to become dark. It becomes even darker if you see the site as being associated with the countless slaves who died building this, and you start excavating into that kind of history. So in some ways, this is it's a conceptual tool rather than an official classification. Whether we decide to include stuff within this idea of dark tourism, all that simply allows for is it opens up an extra body of literature which we as theorists can draw upon to try and make sense of it. It's not necessarily kind of essential or unessential that it is classed in that way. Does that answer the question? Thank you.
I have a question to Dr. Papia Mazzoon. Ma'am, you shed your lights. Can you please share your opinion on the Anthropocene interventions other than the Sundarban region, please?
Anthropocene intervention, you said?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I might
other than the Sundarban region.
Other than, okay.
Some other places focusing
some other parts, yeah. So I think the coal belt that I was just mentioning about, so it's primarily inhabited by tribal minority groups. And what I could see that, because it's being kind of operating on this stone quarry, if you know it, like, as I said, that, we are kind of extracting stones, basalt stones to create stone chips, which are used widely in construction activities in and around the country. So now they have been quite adjusted to these sort of economic activities. But the impact on that, I mean, hasn't been quite sustainably looked at in terms of like when we were discussing with the inhabitants there, they just said that, ma'am, because it's monsoon time you came. Otherwise, you couldn't have seen like 3 meter distance. Visibility is so low because it's all over. Like, you know, the activities are so unplanned and pollution level goes so high. So I think even if existing conditions of Stone Quarry, we are not mindful of the environmental impact. Now, moving on to the next plan on coal, the new government, you know, initiative, it's being kind of quite now settled. Is like beyond this, beneath this basalt layer, there is coal layer, and it is projected that Asia's biggest coal reserve in a time we are opening up when you all know we are heading for net zero target. So the kind of anthropogenic ideas you can see that is quite worrisome. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
We will now take one last question.
Hello, Dr. Peter. It's a very interesting presentation. Thank you. So my question was, so when you talk about dark tourist spots, so do you look at the role of the consumers, the tourist gaze as passive consumers? Secondly, as reification of the already existing power structures, or also you see their agency as challenging the narrative, right? Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Are you by any chance a theorist? Because that sounds like a highly theoretical question.
Yes.
Okay, so yes, again, like everything else, the notion of a dark tourist gaze is a useful kind of conceptual tool for allowing us to think through this. It's not an empirical reality by any stretch of the imagination. Once you start actually visiting sites, once you start exploring sites, once you start getting down into the detail of the sites, you start realizing that agency is much more fluid than that, I suppose. That people, through their engagements, change dominant narratives. They contest dominant narratives, not always consciously. Very often the simple act of going along with things actually subverts it. And there are multiple kind of roles of tourist agency in this sense. In some ways, if I was to develop these concepts, these aren't concepts that I've actually come up with, as well as the use of, I guess might sound awfully French of me, but as well as the use of the kind of theorists I mentioned there, I think the work of Henri Lefebvre and the production of space offers us a kind of more useful way in some ways for acknowledging how space is produced and contested simultaneously in this kind of like dialectical sort of fashion. That might be a more useful way of thinking through this. Does that answer the question? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your question and your explanation, esteemed guests. To formally conclude this academic session, I invite Dr. Manjari Singh, Assistant Professor at Amity Institute of International Studies, to deliver her vote of thanks.
Thank you, Anji. It is my honor to deliver the vote of thanks for this enriching and insightful session. I think all of us will agree with that. With the blessings of Honorable Founder President, the Honorable Chancellor, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, and the entire Amity family, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guests. I would like to express our sincere thanks to the delegation of University of Leeds. It is truly a privilege that the University of Leeds and the Amity University, and particularly Amity Institute of International Studies, have come together for this enriching exchange of ideas. The University of Leeds, as we all know, with its rich legacy as a world-renowned institution, stands as a beacon of academic excellence and innovative research. Its commitment to addressing global challenges through interdisciplinary approaches is truly commendable, and we are deeply honored to have hosted such distinguished scholars and experts today. This collaboration between the University of Leeds and Amity University opens new avenues for knowledge sharing, fostering global partnerships, and promoting cutting edge research in fields that impact not just our nations, but the world at large. We look forward to deepening this relationship in the years to come. I extend my heartfelt gratitude towards Dr. Charlie Dandrieu, Associate Professor at the School of Politics and International Studies, University of Leeds, for his enlightening talk on the right-wing European Parliament and the future of the country. Your perspective has deepened our understanding of the evolving political landscape. You emphasized on how elections are important. Of course, we all know that elections are celebratory. We know about this in our own country, how it is kind of a season. And then you went on to discuss about how there is a big question on the coexistence, the collective ideas to address collective challenges in the current elections that happened in 2024. And then you said that how, for the first time, the elections of in Europe symbolize on how this integration is probably done with. You also emphasized on the role of EU in European politics and economy and society. You went on to talk about the 2024 elections, how it returned a high level of anti-EU MEPs than ever before. And finally, you talked about, and you asked a very pertinent question on whether or not this is the end of European integration. And then you argue in favor and against it by giving examples through various variables of security, Brexit, COVID, and collaborations. And then towards the end, you talked about how, or is it that the EU has lost the support of its electorate? So thank you so much for that, very innovative kind of presentation. Then I'm also thankful to Dr. Papia Majumdar, who is also from the School of Politics and International Studies. Thank you for your insightful presentation on climate impacts and on climate impacts on health policies in India. And your focus on this critical issue was both timely and impactful. In fact, you very eloquently focused on how climate impacts the mental as well as the physical health in India. Then you focused on, you went on to give examples from the floods in West Bengal, in Manipur, in Kerala, in Andhra Pradesh, etc. And then you focused on the role of IPCC in mapping data on climate change, disasters, and hazards. You also emphasized on the role of Green Party in Europe. And then you also talked about how Mrs. Indira Gandhi played a pivotal role when she talked about environmental and climate justice. And she pointed out that poverty is the biggest polluter. I think I've taught this in all my classes. And thus, how the developing world should first focus on elevating the poverty. Then you also focused on the Anthropocene period and how it is impacting the human intervention along and in terms of also impacting the climate and the environmental conditions. Then you also talked about how India has adopted the concept of climate justice and climate equity. Then coming to Dr. Peter Doak from the School of Social Policy. Thank you for your thoughtful discourse on dark tourism. That was a very interesting concept we got to know today. Your reflections opened new dimensions of understanding on how tourist gaze shapes the regional dynamics. And you talked about how there is a focus on mass tourism, the tourist gaze, and the reinventing of areas through the tourist gaze. Then you went on to talk about how this tourist gaze creates beautification, the Disneyfication that you talked about, and how it is also leading to eradication and exclusion of societies. You went on to talk about the conceptualizing of dark tourism, and then you talked about how there is a very eerie kind of fatal attraction to such sites associated with deaths or conflicts or wars or any kind of dark happenings or sinister connotation. And towards the end, you talked about how Thana tourism is different from dark tourism. And then you also emphasized on the dissonant heritage. So I think it has been a very wholesome kind of a, session altogether. My special thanks to Ms. Shweta Dutt, the country advisor, South Asia region, University of Leeds, for being a key facilitator of this collaboration and for your presence here today. A big thank you to Professor Nirupma Prakash. She she spoke and left, for her insightful remarks and for her constant support in shaping this event. And a very warm thank you to Professor Nagalakshmi Raman, Director and Head, Amity Institute of International Studies, for your gracious welcome remarks and for setting the tone for today's meaningful discussions and, in fact, for facilitating this entire session for us. Our appreciation goes to all the heads of institutions who had graced the occasion today, as well as the faculty members and specifically my colleagues from AIS who have assumed various roles and portfolios to bring this event to fruition. My student coordinators and various teams of operation and logistics, photography, hospitality, and various other portfolios who have participated in this event. I am grateful to our ever helpful staff, Ms. Rupashri, Ms. Maya, Mr. Daya, and Mr. Ankit, and our dear students who played a key role in organizing and ensuring the smooth execution of this event. Finally, a heartfelt thanks to our attentive audience, without whose support and interest, organizing such an event would have never been a successful venture, whose engagement made today's discussions vibrant and thought-provoking. I think all of us agree to it because of the kind of questions that were put forth to the speakers. And thank you once again to all who contributed to the success of this event. We look forward to future collaborations and continued academic exchanges. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, for those closing words of gratitude. Thank you all for your active participation, and we look forward to seeing you again in yet another insightful session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I've got some information sheets about University of Leeds. If anyone's interested in collecting it, please collect them from the dais. Thank you.
Those who want to get to know more about the University of Leeds can collect the brochure from me.